This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello and welcome to the Twilight Show. Thanks for joining me. Today, my special guest is Pablo Toledo. Pablo is a teacher and teacher trainer based in Argentina. He's very much involved and interested in student assessment.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Twilight Show, everyone. I'm Stanley, speaking to you live from Mexico City. As I mentioned in the introduction, on today's show, I'll be talking to Pablo Toledo from Argentina about assessment. Pablo Toledo is an English teacher and teacher trainer, and he holds a postgraduate advanced certificate in educational assessment from the University of Cambridge and a diploma in education policy from Universidad Torquato de Tella. Before joining Cambridge Assessment English, Pablo managed projects in the area of remote teaching, internationalization of higher education and language teaching to refugees for the British Council, and he led the education department of the Buenos Aires Herald newspaper. He is the vice president of LALTA, the Latin American Association of Language Testing and Assessment. And I'll be talking to Pablo about assessment and more after the Teachers Talk Radio news.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading. Bet UK is empowering the everyday wins, cheeky grins, big conversations, budding aspirations. Our goal? To make EdTech accessible and teaching exceptional. Join the global education community on the 24th to the 26th of January 2024 as we make education better together. Tick it off your Christmas list today. Get your free ticket before the 13th of December deadline. Visit www.uk.betshow.com/visitor-registration.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The inquest into the death of head teacher Ruth Perry has ruled that an Ofsted inspection contributed because it lacked fairness, respect and sensitivity and was, at times, rude and intimidating. These are the comments from the senior coroner Heidi Connor, as reported on the BBC News website. Mrs. Connor went on to express concern about the impact the inspection system can have on school leaders. This is the first time Ofsted has been listed as a contributing factor in the death of a head teacher. The coroner also issued a Prevention of Future Death Notice, a report that aims to stop similar situations arising again. Anyone who gets such a notice has 56 days to say what they plan to do to mitigate the chances of deaths happening. Education unions, Ofsted Chief Inspector Amanda Spielman and Education Secretary Gillian Keegan have all released statements following the inquest. These can be found across media outlets. A statement by Mrs. Perry's sister, Professor Julia Waters, made it clear that this situation must never be allowed to happen again, but that Ruth was a much more than a victim. She was a sister, a wife, and a mother. The Programme for International Student Assessment, or PISA, has released its latest findings. Making the headlines amongst the data was a figure of 11% of teens in the UK who were skipping or missing a meal at least once a week as a result of poverty. The average was 8%, although it rose to 13% in the USA and to 19% in Turkey. The report makes the link between missing meals and less effective learning. Every 4 years, PISA compares 15-year-olds' reading, science and maths levels across 81 countries. The director of the project described the UK as being in a fairly good spot, with improvements in reading and maths, although there was a decline in science. Amongst the 4 home nations, England performed the highest across all 3 subjects, although the average maths score fell for all UK nations. The gap in results between UK nations has widened, with Wales recording its worst results so far, according to the BBC. The Welsh Education Minister said COVID-19 had derailed improvement. Northern Ireland scored higher than Scotland in maths and science, but Scotland did better in reading. The Wellbeing Survey is the first of its kind, with the head of research expressing surprise that so many pupils in a supposedly wealthy country are missing meals due to food poverty. Another survey, this time by the British Council, has also seen its results released. They asked just over 2,000 pupils at the end of their first year of secondary from across the UK about modern foreign languages. The results showed that only 20% planned to study a language at GCSE. The numbers of pupils taking modern foreign languages has been in decline in recent years. Whilst 73% of those taking part in the survey said children should have the chance to learn a language, and 46% said they enjoyed language learning, more than 1 in 4 said that they did not plan to take the subject at GCSE level or beyond. Nearly 9 out of 10 said they did not think it was very likely that language would be necessary for their future career. Finally, writer and poet Benjamin Zephaniah passed away on the 7th of December at the age of 65. He had been diagnosed with a brain tumour 8 weeks ago. Zephaniah had 14 poetry collections and 5 novels published over the years. He openly discussed his difficulties with learning to read and write, leaving school at 13 and his diagnosis of dyslexia. His first book was published in 1980, and he described himself as an angry young man who had an outlet through writing. He said that using writing as expression had saved his life. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Welcome back, everyone, and welcome in particular to my special guest, Pablo Toledo. Thank you so much for joining me, Pablo. How are you?
Thank you, Graham, for the invitation. Always a pleasure.
How have you been today? What have you been up to?
Not much else going on today, but it's a lovely pre-summer day here in Argentina, so it looks like it's going to be a great weekend.
Yes, of course. I forget that actually December and January are probably the nicest months to be in your part of the world as far as the weather's concerned, isn't it?
Yes, and you have this lovely irony where most of the advertising and Christmas movies and all of the icons show snow and Santa Claus wearing fairy clothes, but it's 35, 40 degrees.
Yes, I remember when I lived in Uruguay going to the shopping centers and there was kind of like all this snowy, Christmassy things. And outside it was like, really hot and everybody was on the beach.
Absolutely. And we also have this thing where most of the European immigrants brought their Christmas food and we just kept it. So we have great winter food in the middle of summer, which is a heart attack waiting to happen.
Yeah, definitely. So, Pablo, I usually start by asking my guests to talk about how they became involved in education, how they become teachers. So I'd love to hear what it was that attracted you to education, how you became a teacher.
It was like some of the people who've been guests on the show. When you ask this question, I got here by chance. So it was a series of fortunate events in the end. I wasn't great at English as a kid. I started learning English sort of older, and I just got some really bad lessons at the primary school where I was going, starting when I was 10, and I wasn't great at it. my mother had to drag me kicking and screaming into a language school when I started secondary school. There's a legend that someone that I knew professionally later was the director of studies, and that I went into her office sort of refusing to go and looking sulky with my mom saying, "You're coming here whether you like it or not." And at some point in the middle of that, when I was sort of ending my secondary school, I got kind of a knack for it. Sort of, it started making sense. Then I made friends with someone who's still my best friend today, with Guillermo, and he was a huge Beatles fan, and his mom was a famous English teacher here in Argentina, so he had lots of books and lots of motivation and stuff around the house. So we started I started tuning into English from a place that was more like, we love Beatles together, and sort of he shared, like, the first books that I read in proper English were books that he gave me, which were like analysis of Beatles lyrics and stuff like that. And then I started getting better at it. And by the time I finished secondary school, I also won a trip for a 1-month course in Brighton, sort of like a 3-week course in Brighton in one of these academies, which was like the language school where I was going, because my grades were good. They had a raffle between like people who had good grades in the course. And so I won that. And that kind of sealed the deal. I was into English. So I wasn't going to study to become a teacher, but literally, I mean, classes here in Argentina start in March. So on a February day, I was out with friends, and a friend told me, tomorrow I'm starting a sort of preparation course for for an English teacher training college, because there was an entrance exam and they had just a 1-month course to prepare you for the admission. I didn't even know the name of the institution. I said, "What's that?" He said, "Oh, you should try that." My plan at that stage is that I was going to become a journalist. I was going to study at university communications, and my plan was to become a journalist. So on that was a Sunday at 9 p.m. So course starts tomorrow at 8. You should come. I said, why not? I mean, like, it's an English course. It's this place. And then I just showed up, and I did the course, and I started the course. I did really well. I sailed through the entrance exam. And then I told my friend, "Hey, I'm going to this place." "Oh, and then I told my best friend, there is this place." He said, "Yeah, I'm going to study there as well, because my mom is a teacher there, and it's a great place." It turns out to be the Joaquín B. González, which is sort of a famous historical teacher training institution. I didn't even know how to spell the name of that. And then I just showed up, and that was it. I canceled my plans to study communications at university on my first day of teacher training. I had my first language and phonetics and things. I had my first lessons, and I said, "This is serious. This takes dedication. This is not a language course, and this is what I want to do." And things flowed from there. I took quite a few turns in my career. Sort of career-wise, I've done a number of things, which led me to the place where I am today, which is that I haven't been in front of a classroom in a while. And I have done several things connected with that. I mean, funnily enough, I mentioned that my plan was to become a journalist. For 10 years, I worked in an English language newspaper. I started there as an educational publisher and inventing an education section and an education department for that newspaper. So I ended up where I wanted to be originally, from a different place. And then I got back to doing other things connected with teaching. But
so I'd love to, could you talk a little bit more about how you ended up in the Buenos Aires Herald?
In the Buenos Aires Herald? Sure. It started with a post on an email newsletter.
Because there was were you working as a teacher before that, after you finished teacher training college, etc.?
So after I finished, in my last years, I was working all over the place. I was doing in-company training. I was working secondary schools. I was anywhere that would have me. I was working at the Asociación Argentina de Cultura Inglesa, which is a big language school. But I was a teacher, I get up at 7:30. My first lesson starts at 8 a.m. and I'm teaching until 9 in the evening. So I was doing that life. And the one thing I never got the knack of was working with young learners, but everything else I tried at some point. And I was beginning to get interested in teacher training. So I was an assistant at a literature course for teacher training, and I was preparing for that. I was doing many, many things. And I wrote a post at News and Views, which was a newsletter published by Martin Ayers, who ended up working for IATEFL, or who's still, and who was based in Argentina. And it was a post about, it was called Howl. Funnily enough, it ended up quoted by Jeremy Harmer in his handbook for language teachers, which is kind of my claim to fame in the ELT literature, that I have one reference by Jeremy Harmer. And it was like, it was based on Allen Ginsberg's Howl. I have seen the best minds of my generation. And it was a big rant about how much I hated the idea that the big Illuminati of ELT were all people who were coming from the international houses, or sort of like the big institutions, which were like backpacking Brits or native speakers, telling people like me, bottom of the southern hemisphere, how it should be done, when I have 35 kids in a public primary school in front of me, or secondary school there. And it was this rant about that. It got posted in the newsletter. I put a bit of flair into it because I have seen the best teachers of my generation, their lesson plans bleeding. It is floating on the internet somewhere. And then he published it and he liked it and he said, would you like to extend that? And then he put it on the journal version of that. And that got seen by someone at the Buenos Aires Herald, who said, you obviously have a knack for writing. On the side, I've always done writing workshops. I have a side career as a literary writer. And so I put a bit of that panache into it. And then they contacted me and said, we like the way you write. Would you like to do something for the newspaper? Originally it was, and I said, yeah, anything. And he said, well, we're interested in this education and technology thing. And we're talking about 1999, so most people didn't have internet. So I started with a column which was 200 words a week on some website or tech resource that got in the newspaper. And then I started from there. They started giving me like other assignments. I started sort of saying, I would like to do this, I would like to do that. There is this person coming. Would you be interested in an interview to someone in ELT? And because it was an English language newspaper, English teachers were like natural readership. So it flowed from there. And then it became bigger and bigger. In the course of 4 years, the person that brought me on left. So I got in charge of the sort of the education department, which was like one weekly page and then some kind of supplements, and it grew from there. We had Write On, which is one of the projects I've done that I'm the proudest of, which was a magazine for teenagers in English written by teenagers. So I was basically the editor in charge of a newsroom, if you like, of 15, 16, 17-year-olds, which were doing it voluntarily and did the most amazing magazine you've ever read. It was professional, it was dedicated. The degree of commitment and professionalism is the most I've seen. And I worked in a professional newsroom at the time. And then over time, I ended up sort of doing education. Then the newspaper changed courses and I became the culture and entertainment editor. And I did that for a few years. So working in a newsroom like the journalist life, which was my original career plan. And then I was teaching alongside, and then I said, I want to go back to something more connected with teaching, which is when I started and I found a way back into the kind of work that I liked, working for the British Council, sort of doing more things like project management. I found this weird thing. I was listening to one of the past guests in the podcast, talking about how she had seen somebody doing a presentation in teacher training and finding that was a place they wanted to be. I found that was a place I wanted to be, but also I started working with professional associations pretty early on in my career, organizing conferences, being a volunteer and that. So I found that every time I went to an ELT event, I gravitated towards standing at the back of the room, helping out the organizers. So I found that I liked this idea of setting up the thing and planning the thing and sort of making things happen and being around the audience as much as I enjoyed being in the audience for these things. So I found a place, I found my way, I gravitated towards doing that more, which is a bit of what I'm doing now.
Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know a lot of that, so thanks for sharing that.
It's
Um,
yeah, it's been a winding road. Sort of, it's taken quite unexpected turns along the way, but it's been fun.
yeah, I think that's the case for most people that I speak to. It's very rare that someone plans to do something and that's what they end up doing for all of
Yeah,
their life, etc.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, I've got two kids, and my daughter now, she started university this year. So my one piece of dad advice for her career planning wise was, because she was kind of, am I choosing the right thing for me? Is this what I want? Obsessing about that, which is what you do because you're a teenager, you're
yeah,
deciding your life. It is a big deal. And
yeah,
I said, don't worry. I mean, just look at me. Look at all the things I've done in the middle. I did like four different careers and I did them all wrong. I ended up where I am. I'm happy with the things I've done. I wouldn't be happier if I had just done one of those things and stayed on
yeah,
the tracks. So whatever you do, there's always time to shift course and find your own way.
yeah. That's good advice, I think, definitely. So, Pablo, you're working with assessment now. You work for Cambridge.
So
What's
I
your
work
role
for Cambridge,
exactly?
Cambridge University Press and Assessment, and my role is something called Assessment Services Manager,
Right.
which is basically mm, connected to, I mean, the fact that I am kind of, it's a bit like assessment is a difficult product in the sense that I mean, many teachers think of assessment as there is this exam and I just
Hmm.
get my students to do it, or many people in a school say,
Yeah, yeah,
there is this exam that exists, call it what you will, it's done by Cambridge or anyone else, but I will just bring the exam in and that's the exam I need.
yeah,
Or But the thing is that many of the people that run institutions that make big decisions based on assessment, many teachers, the training and understanding of assessment and how it integrates with the thing that they are doing is not that great.
yeah.
Because teacher training is not really strong in assessment.
Mm,
Assessment is a very technical area. So my role is kind of to stand in the middle of that. So I do a lot of teacher training. I go to many teacher conferences. I do lots of sessions for teachers on how assessment works, how the particular assessment that Cambridge does works and how it integrates, but also working with institutions and other partners, let's say stakeholders, on how assessment can integrate into their curriculums, into their programs, into the decisions they're making. What are sort of a kind of assessment-based analysis of how it works, and also on the more, many of the people that design assessment are by necessity very technical about assessment because assessment is a very technical area in itself. And I am kind of a translator from one to the other into, with I have one foot in pedagogy, another foot of being on the ground, sort of
yeah,
having been a classroom teacher, working with classroom teachers and schools. But also, I understand enough about assessment that I wouldn't be able to do an assessment from scratch without a lot of extra training. But I have done sort of studies in assessment specifically, which allow me to kind of translate, to tell an assessment person to understand assessment from a technical perspective and see how it fits into the classroom, but then to be able to tell someone who is in the classroom or running an institution or running an education system what kind of assessment decisions can help them. If you do this, it's going to imply that kind of thing. So it's a mixture of. Uh, I've been compared by people who worked in tech to an architect's solution, whatever that is. So I'm going with that.
Okay. So a lot of your work then is around perhaps what we would say is assessment literacy. Sort of,
Definitely. Most of the work is basically assessment literacy for teachers, assessment literacy for institutional leaders. And sort of that's kind of become my mission, and sort of personally, professionally, I feel that that is a thing that we need a lot more of. That a
right.
lot of the things, that many things, both in language, in assessment, and in the way assessment has an impact on the way people learn language and in education in general, come from not enough assessment literacy.
Yeah.
So I think it's a worthy. I think it's very necessary.
Oh, definitely. From what I've seen, I think it's really necessary. I think a lot of teachers, a lot of institutions still believe, I think, although you would know a lot better than me, that assessment is kind of either a necessary evil or something that you kind of bolt on at the end, which is not really the case. To get the most out of assessment,
No,
you need to build it in from the beginning, and you need to have a kind of more balanced idea of what it is, don't you?
absolutely. And it becomes a very, almost an ideological thing or a culture. I mean, there is, uh, my role is a more like half regional role. So I work
Mm-hmm.
with a number of countries. So sort of, so I am lucky that I get to work for a British organization.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a bit of this kind of European and specifically British culture where assessment is really embedded in education systems,
Mm-hmm.
where the idea is that there isn't really a strong curriculum as such in the UK, or there isn't a strong monitoring of what the schools teach. Everything is done through assessment because, of course, you sit through different rounds of assessment in the UK education system, I mean, well, different countries in the UK work differently. The Welsh is not the Scottish, is not the English, but whatever you do, there's always an exam that comes at 11. There's an exam that comes at 15. There's an exam that comes, well, and there is this sense that assessment comes. It's a fact of life, and it's how you do it. But there is this cultural place for assessment in education that is very specific, that happens in many countries around the world. Well, I happen to have been educated and live in a country that has the exact opposite of that. Argentina has zero standardized assessment. Latin America in general is very opposed to the idea of standardized assessment as a default position, with the possible exception of countries like Chile or Colombia. And I'm thinking South America now. There is no country that has like a standardized primary, secondary school, standardized external government mandated testing system. And actually, the view that teachers have, and that's the view that I was trained on in my teacher training, and all of my colleagues, is that external assessment, standardized assessment, is the devil, and that assessment is a necessary evil. But
Yeah.
especially when you have someone who is not the teacher, when it is not classroom led, it is the absolute worst thing you can have. And so going back to your question of assessment literacy and these beliefs about assessment, they really shape what happens in education. And I am lucky enough that I get to work with 9 different countries directly. So everything south of Colombia except for Brazil. So that's 9 countries that I work with hands-on,
Mm.
and working for a UK organization. So I see all of these assessment cultures and all of the things that happen with one thing, with another thing, and what one can bring into the other. And what I see all over in the places that have a strong sort of default belief that standardized external assessment is the only thing there is, and in the places that have a strong belief that that is the devil, etc., is that still in all of those contexts, people don't understand enough about assessment to really see the potential that assessment has and the impact that the assessment decisions they make, whatever they are, have in what happens in the classroom and in the lives of people, in
Yeah.
the actual lives of students, which is sort of like the most important thing, in the language that they learn, but also in their opportunities in life. Because we think of, well, it is a thing that is going to allow you to have a better sort of flow or a better journey as a language learner. But also in the case of assessment, if you don't pass certain exams, your life plans will change. If you don't pass a C1 exam and you are planning to study abroad, you are not going to study abroad because the language requirement, you may have to pass that exam as a language requirement. If you fail that exam, you will have to delay your plans. I mean, I always mention the case of Brazil and Science Without Borders. Sort of there was this, during the first Lula government in Brazil,
Mhm.
we're getting off course, we're getting further and further away from the
Okay,
classroom,
don't
so
worry.
interrupt me when you like. But in the first Lula government, I mean, in Latin America, the thing with education is there's never any money. Well,
Right.
when Lula first came to government, he said, yeah, there's money, and we're going to use it to internationalize our universities, our students, our teachers, our everybody. So I want tens of thousands of Brazilian students, university students, university professors, researchers, everybody, to just go all over the place, and the federal government will fund you to go and sort of be embedded in universities all over the world, research institutions all over the world, and just bring that back to Brazil, and we will take it from there. And what happened was that about 75% of the people who applied wanted to go to Portugal. No, Portugal is a cool place
for the
to
language,
be,
basically.
but that's basically because that's where that's where everything happens in Portuguese. It's a different dialect of Portuguese. Portuguese and Brazilians claim they don't understand each other very well, but it cannot be that bad. So it was better than going somewhere where they were going to speak English and you had zero English. So what came out of that is that the fact that they didn't have a language policy and that they didn't have an assessment policy for language meant that everybody was literally unable to take up those opportunities. And that had an impact in the development of the program. What came out of that was that Science Without Borders became Language Without Borders. It was basically, if we don't take care of this, and if we don't do not just a language policy, but a certification policy, an assessment-led policy, we are not going to be able to get anything out of it. We are not going to be able to make this happen. So if you don't make the right assessment decisions early on, you may find that the knock-on effect of that, even at that massive scale, is huge. Now, so on a personal level, on a nationwide level, making sort of the lack of an understanding of how assessment works, what assessment can bring, and why you may need it, can have all kinds of knock-on effects. Personally, classroom, school-based, nationwide. So I think every time I talk about this, I bring up Science Without Borders, because that is a textbook case of an opportunity wasted because of the language policy was not there, the assessment policy was not there, and basically people were not ready. And when you talk to people who work in higher education, the story of the brilliant student who had the opportunity to go on a scholarship, but had like a 3-week window for an application that included a language certificate that they didn't have, is a classic one. It happens anywhere you ask, at least Latin America. So making sure that doesn't happen is one of my missions.
Yes, that's fascinating. I love that example. That's a great one. Pablo, what, in your experience and having knowledge of a lot of countries in the region, where do you think they are getting it right? Where, this idea of having appropriate assessment solutions, standardized testing, but not overly relying upon a test, for example, either nationally or regionally, etc. Where do you think they have got the kind of balance right that you've seen, or isn't there anywhere at the moment?
There is no magic trick. I mean, different ways of doing it work for different places.
So it's contextual.
In Latin America, it's very contextual. And there are ways of getting everything right, and there are ways of getting everything wrong. I mean, you talk to people in places that are very standardized assessment led. I mean, I'm pretty sure if you ask 100 teachers in the UK how they feel about assessment, they will not say that the UK gets it right.
Mm-hmm.
They will. There are horror stories everywhere you look.
Of course.
And something similar in the US. I mean, the US has a similar assessment culture, and which is complicated by the fact that there are 50 different education systems. Well, actually, it's even municipal-led, which makes it even more difficult to get. But looking at Latin America, Colombia is in an interesting position, because Colombia has an institution called ICFES, and they made a decision years ago which amazingly for Latin America has held on, which to start, I'm not going to say from scratch, but from kind of scratch, an assessment institution that was going to look at education as a whole and how the country is doing, and that they were going to get to develop the expertise and to have the set policies that were going to enable them to sort of profit from that. And ICFES does a number of things for Colombia. Not all Colombians will agree that all the things that they do are particularly brilliant, but they have developed competency exams in different areas which are used for progression from secondary into university, for things like university admission. They have developed a language exam of their own, and they developed a department that was able to do that with assistance from other organizations, which is really interesting and which has a place. And then they have embedded sort of external certification for languages specifically at different key places. So it's an interesting blend, not going all the way into European or American style or Asian style sort of thing, because we always forget that the people who invented, let's say, the first sort of some of the first examples of places where assessment was the basis for progression in life was China. I mean, Confucian culture was based on big, very high stakes assessment for opportunities in life, to get admission to university, to working for the empire, sort of to become like a government official, to get opportunities. But I digress. Colombia gets it. Colombia has an interesting position, which is kind of in between, with one pretty firmly planted foot on a standardized assessment thing. Chile is closer to, has that as well, although it has had a strong resistance, a strong backlash against that. So now CINCE, which was sort of their evaluation institute, has come under fire for a number of reasons, with the education reforms and the resistance in the past 4 or 5 years. So it's in flux, but they haven't chucked it out the window. They haven't said, even though there has been a lot of resistance against some of the effects that had in Chile, they haven't come to a place where they say, we're going to do away with assessment. So Chile, Colombia are interesting places to look at in terms of a kind of blend of these things, of the countries I know. Uruguay is, of course, in an interesting place because in language assessment, because they have, together with programs like Say Vale en Inglés, which you may have heard of, or with some of the initiatives that they had in terms of language policy, from the beginning, they said, we need to assess the impact of this. And they started bringing in different forms of external assessment. And they have offered in public education external assessment for languages for pretty much everybody in the education system that would like to have it. And they have eventually, sort of over years, done the heavy lifting of developing an assessment tool of their own for a specific need that they had. They said, we need this thing in this way for this program with these purposes. It doesn't exist. It's not there. It's not something that we could just bring in ready-made. Okay, what does it take to do it? And it took a lot of work, and they did all the work. They worked with the right people, and they held it on over years. And they developed a tool of their own, which they started implementing. Pros and cons to everything you do. So I could give you a list of pros and a list of cons on that particular thing, and of that particular path. But but that's an interesting country in terms of applying an interesting language policy and understanding that without an assessment sort of pillar, that thing was not going to work. If they were not able to demonstrate how the thing worked and understand how the thing worked, then that was not going to happen. So Uruguay, Colombia, and Chile are interesting places to look at in Latin America, of where assessment is a bit different, sort of where they think of assessment as an interesting blend of the teacher is the only assessor or external is the only assessor. They found an interesting in between.
Interesting. And what about outside the region? Are there any sort of examples? You mentioned China before, of where you think there are interesting developments in assessment that are showing the right way to go?
I think the some of the things that happen, I mean, it gets a lot of stick from a lot of places, but the idea and the impact of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages is a good example of how everything comes together. It gets a lot of stick because, well, it's people think of that as a list of things to do, and it orders people and it streamlines you, and then it's the basis for everything, and it's commercial, and it's this and it's that. It's none of those things. I mean, the project that started the Common European Framework has its basis on let's build a tool for international development. Let's build a tool to enable people to live their lives beyond their borders. And in that sense, it has had an amazing effect. The Common European Framework has sort of, people criticize it for all kinds of things. A common criticism from some Latin Americans is it says European in it, like it brings embedded a lot of European ideas, and that is true to some extent. I mean, it is competence based, which not everybody loves, and it is geared at things like internationalization of higher education and cross borders employability, which may not be the only reason. If you look at the more advanced levels, if you look at C1, for instance, C1 is a great example of a level that was designed with one thing in mind, which is admission to postgraduate studies. And a lot of that, now, can you be are there advanced users of language that do not want to be university students? A lot of them. Are they 100% served by the standards of the C1 level? Honestly speaking, maybe not. But I mean, it doesn't do the whole thing for everybody. Yet, the Common European Framework has allowed for a great use of assessment, which is, and a great, sort of does a great service to basically the world, which is, you can say, there is such a thing as B2 level of any language, and there is such a thing as a C1 and an A2 level of any language. We can define it for that language, something like the English Profile project in the case of English, but also things that the Instituto Cervantes has done for Spanish, that Alliance Française has done for French, and so on. You can define it for different languages in terms of vocabulary, grammar, this, that, whatever. You can test it. You can find ways of testing it better in one way or other. It's open enough that you can test it in different ways. It is specific enough that you can test it. And you can use it as an international shared language, as a framework. Now, that is an amazing use of assessment. That is an amazing service of assessment for the lives of people, that you can get a certificate in any language for B1, B2, C1, whatever, and that you can understand what it brings you in terms of, I can apply to this university, I can work here, my language is enough to do that, or even things like, there are graded readers and I'm able to access this, or this is what it should imply. That is really very useful. And in terms of assessment, it has opened doors for many uses of assessment which have actually helped the lives of people. Has every use of assessment that comes from that helped the lives of people? Well, nothing's perfect, but it's a good sort of, it's a good example. Now, if you look internationally, I think the things that would make something interesting in terms of assessment or something useful is where basically three things happen. Basically, where you have enough of something that is standardized that you can understand, that you can sort of apply it consistently, that everybody knows what they're talking about, and doing kind of the same thing. Because if you don't, that's not fair and that's not right. But then when you have enough empowerment of the teacher and the institution that they are not locked by the assessment structure, and where it is useful in the context, where it makes sense in the context where that happens. often we tend to ignore one of these three things. So if you just adopt something international without thinking about it, because that's the exam that the world uses, it may not make sense in your context.
Yeah.
If you do something that is fully classroom based, it may not help sort of when your students leave your school. If you do something fully external, then it may not make sense for your school or your context or both. So it's where those three things happen, that's what makes it interesting.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's a lot. I remember teaching before the CEFR was fully in place or used a lot. And it made it very difficult to compare between different languages because each of the languages had its own way of measuring it, and you had to look at sort of different charts that some people or organizations had mapped to be able to see how to compare, your use of Spanish with use of English, etc., wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was a
And
nightmare.
And where it's not applied, I mean, Latin America is a place where the Common European Framework is used by some countries, but not for everything, and other countries openly don't use it. And you still have things like, they define things like level 1, level 5, pre-intermediate, advanced, and no one quite agrees what that means. In some countries, I've seen it in Colombia and Mexico, you see things like job ads where people are expected to have 70% English. Which is fascinating, because what's that even supposed to mean?
I don't think I've got 70% English, and
there you go. So yeah, and what is the difference between 70, 75, and 40? So and the other thing is that standards are very useful. I mean, we think of assessment in terms of English because that's what we do. We teach English, but think of the other kinds of assessment, like getting a driving exam is a form of assessment. Mm-hmm. Professional licensing is a form of assessment, and it is true. As teachers, we have this tendency to think, well, we are sometimes too student-centered. So we think, oh, poor student. So we have to define things in terms of your individual learning journey. We have to define a form of assessment that is going to be friendly to you and all that. But let's do doctors. Now, imagine that you have a student-centered medical licensing board. So they say, oh, because this is how you have made amazing progress as a doctor. You can do most things that a doctor can do, and you have made amazing progress from where you started to where you are. And you've put in a lot of effort. This is the best doctor you can be. We'll give you a license, even though you don't have the skills it takes to be a doctor.
Yeah.
Would you feel safe as a patient? Would you feel safe as a patient going to a hospital if that were the case? Or when we think, well, we want to the knock-on effect of things like, again, another classic example is the pilots. Because some people say, well, you don't necessarily have to master everything in the syllabus to get, you may want to get partial certification. You may want to acknowledge the fact that I went that I didn't have the opportunity to develop this particular skill. Okay, you are a pilot. You know how to do everything a plane needs to do except land it. So we'll give you a license because it's just that one thing you don't know. So, it's sometimes it is important to have those hard and fast things because it matters.
Yeah. But then I think the reason why assessment sometimes has a bad rap, if you like, is because all of us have grown up and have feared the test, the exam. Yeah. And also when education becomes sort of driven by passing an exam to take it to an extreme, which has happened. I'm sure you've seen it. I've seen it. Then it becomes something that almost becomes meaningless, but it also can lead to a lot of stress and a lot of negative reactions from students. And I think that's probably where things in the past have gone wrong.
In the past and in the present. I mean, we know that that's still the case for many people. Now, it is true. I mean, is it fair that 12 years in the life of someone who's been through primary, secondary school are defined by what I do one afternoon or one morning when I sit for that one exam. So no, I cannot really, I mean, we can't, that is one extreme. And that's not actually assessment. That is one specific way of doing testing. You can have portfolios which acknowledge my journey through that. You can have that one day modulated, be one more data point in my assessment strategy. And that, I think, is the ideal thing. I mean, where
so continuous assessment, basically.
Continuous assessment, or an integration of the two, because also continuous assessment alone will not give you that integrated thing. I mean, if you think of language specifically, all of the things that, I mean, yes, it is true. I mean, writing a 400-word essay in one sitting. So grab your pens, this is your subject, write 450 words, you have 60 minutes. And then we will grade that. It is true that is not, so we know that to do that, you need to be able to do a number of things that you develop over time. And you can look at those individually through continuous assessment. So I can look at the way you organize texts. I can look at the way you have acquired language and tools and the work that you have done over years. I could be assessing those things in the classroom individually and add that up and get a good picture of where you are. Still, if I don't ask you to sit down and do the essay, I don't know if you can integrate those things.
Yeah.
I don't know that you can do that task. So there is a point to having that exam. There is a point to having all of that summation, sort of all of those things put together in one day. I don't think it should be the be-all, start-all, and end-all of it, but I think it's got a place. And many people, because of the rejection of the system where that exam is the only thing that matters, move to the idea that that exam shouldn't exist. I think that should exist. It just shouldn't be the only thing. It should be used for some things, but it shouldn't be the only thing.
And what about the role of formative assessment? So this idea of assessment doesn't have to be summative. It can be formative. It can be assessment for learning rather than of learning. How do you feel that fits in?
And I think it fits in. I mean, first of all, we need to acknowledge that without assessment, there is no learning. I mean, think of a child, think of a baby, a toddler, learning to walk, or learning to take its first steps. How do babies do that? Well, they stand up, they do it a number of times, they try to do it, they fall over, they try to do it, they fall over, they try to do it, they fall over. Now, it's this repetition. Now, if you have repetition without some kind of analysis of what happened, some kind of judgment of what happened, and then some kind of, okay, I will try this different thing next time, or I will not do that thing that failed, then we wouldn't learn to walk. If you look at definitions of learning, the thing that distinguishes mindless repetition from actual learning is the analysis of what we did towards an improvement. I mean, and take any learning theory you like. I mean, I am by heart, my soul is constructivist, so I think of Vygotsky most of the times. But think of any learning theory you like. Even things like, even a very behaviorist one is about transforming your behavior based on outcome analysis. But the constructivist view is that it's a reflective process done in a dialogue with a mentor or someone as a reference, blah, blah, blah. But learning includes assessment. Assessment is embedded in learning. Assessment makes learning. So a teacher is assessing all the time, formatively speaking. The interesting thing when you start reading up on formative assessment is how much of what a teacher does in a regular classroom is actually categorized and classified and described as a formative assessment technique. When you think of something like questioning, okay, teachers make questions. That's the job. They make questions all the time. They lead conversations. Those are formative. That's a form of formative assessment. You think of something like a classic formative assessment strategy, traffic lights. So where you give students like a red, yellow, green signs or something, or a thumbs up or thumbs down, and then you say, what is your understanding of this, or would you and then you ask questions, and then they bring up the thing, the color, the red, the sort of the traffic light color for where they are. That is formative assessment. We do that all the time as a teacher. You ask your students a question, you're looking at their faces, and you're making decisions about what you're going to do next based on, do they look like they get this, or do they look puzzled, or do they look frustrated, or do they look what? That is an assessment. That is a moment of assessment. I mean, the most interesting definition of assessment I found is that assessment is basically gathering evidence about student performance, whatever kind of evidence you want, analyzing that evidence. So making a judgment about it, making a judgment about what our students know or what our students can do based on my analysis of that evidence, and then making a decision based on that analysis. So I gather evidence. My evidence can be the results of a very long exam, or it can be the way their faces look right now. Then I analyze it. Okay, this means they pass, they don't pass, they get this, they get that. Then I judge what they know or what they can do based on it. If they look frustrated, it means they cannot do it. If they look, oh, teacher, it looks like they can do it and I can move on. If they just give me a correct answer, it means this. Or if 60% of if they have correct answers for 60% of this, if they show competence to this rubric, whatever you do. And then you make a decision based on that. Then you make a judgment, and then you make a decision. Then you change your syllabus, or you pass them or fail them, or you give them one more example of simple past versus present perfect, or move on to the next unit. Or then you decide to include a review activity to give them extra homework to do whatever you do. Assessment is a tool for making decisions. Now, that definition applies to formative assessment, summative assessment, any assessment. And where the magic is, where the beauty is in bringing it all together. I have seen this described as integrated learning and assessment, assessment for learning, assessment of learning with the assessment research group, Paul Black, Dylan William, connected learning systems with Barry O'Sullivan, learning-oriented assessment with Nick Saville and others, and more of the European sort of common European framework philosophy of thought. There's a lot of ways of looking at this. But assessment as an activity is something that teachers do every minute that we're teaching. It happens all the time. So if we don't integrate, if we think of assessment as testing, then that's a problem. If we think of assessment without testing, then that's a different kind of problem. The idea is that we need to think of that as all of the ways in which we can gather evidence. We basically have assessment because we cannot see learning. Mm-hmm. I don't care what the neuroscience. Nowadays we have this neuro thing or this data thing where some people claim that they're able to actually see it happen, that you have this hormone and this, I can put a probe in your head and see your brain functioning and all that. We're not there. So I cannot see that whether you can communicate in English or not, to what degree you can do it. I cannot see whether you know this, whether this is part of your active or your passive knowledge of English, whether you recognize this, whether you're able to use it in context or whatever. So how do I know, how do I as a teacher know that you have reached the expectations, that you are making progress, that you have got this and that you're able to move on to the next thing, or that you actually need to step back and review this particular thing that you haven't quite mastered, which is getting in the way of your progress? Well, assessment. I have to ask you to do things. I have to look at the way you do them. I have to think about that, and then I make a decision. Whether I do it as a formative assessment thing, as an end of unit test, or as a big test that comes every 2, 3, 5 years, All of those, actually. Just do it all. But just do it as often and as much as you can.
But not to the extent that you don't teach, that you're only testing, of course.
No, absolutely. But because then if you don't teach, you are not, that's not doing assessment either. That is, if everything you do is exam preparation, then that's bad.
Of course.
Because I mean it's and that there is of course a tendency to do. I mean, the higher this is human behavior. If you make something, if you put, let's say, when assessment becomes a form of gatekeeping, becomes the way you have access to something that you want, then the educational role of assessment becomes irrelevant, and what matters is to get to the next thing.
Yeah.
What I mean is, the moment if I have to pass a test to, I'm thinking of a good example, and I'm not coming up with one, but when you make a test important enough that it's going to decide whether I get something that I want, it stops being about the learning, and it is about how can I get what I want. Why do students cheat in a test? Students cheat in a test because they care about what happens if they pass it more than they care about the learning. Or in the thing that they are doing.
They're more interested in having a certificate that says they have a particular level of a language, for example, than actually having that level of a language.
Exactly. And a classic, I mean, I'm not going to name names, but when I say this, everybody listening to this will understand, will think of examples of what I'm talking about. When I work for an organization that basically sells standardized exams. So what do people pay for when they pay for those exams? Some people are paying for an exam. Others are paying for a diploma. And there is a big difference between what you do when you do that, when you pay for one or the other. It's the same thing. It's the same experience. It's the same journey for everybody. It's just that it happens differently. So you see cases of teachers, schools, parents, students that will only sit for an exam when they know they will get an easy A, when they know they will fly through it. Why? Because they want a certificate. They want they need that certificate for something, or they want sort of a gold star for some reason, and they will only do it if they are satisfied that they can pass it. Now, if you think of that as an assessment, if I present my student, if I have 20 students, 20 of my students sit for that exam, for an exam, 20 of my students get an A, every single one of them, it's meaningless.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean anything. Assessment, one of the problems with assessment is that very negative words in real life have very positive meanings in assessment terms. So a very good thing, a very positive quality for any form of assessment is discrimination. It sounds awful, but it is what it is. Because what an exam is supposed to do is discriminate, tell you the difference between people who are good at something or people who have a certain level of skill and people who don't.
Yeah.
Now, if everybody gets an A, that doesn't discriminate. If everybody fails, that doesn't discriminate. Now, if I sit 20 of my students for an exam, some of them should get an A, some of them should fail, or maybe all of them will pass, but with different degrees of success. Otherwise, it was the wrong exam.
Mm-hmm.
Now, but if I am thinking of an exam as I want the gold star, I just want a certificate, I want parents to feel proud of, to feel happy about the school or the work that I'm doing as a teacher, I want good news, I don't want any of them to feel frustrated, etc., then that exam is not going to serve my learning purposes. It's going to be a distraction to my learning.
Like a PR tool for the parents, basically.
Absolutely. And you see teachers and heads of studies at schools being very concerned when some students fail, for good reason, because that means they will have angry peasants knocking on their doorstep with torches and pitchforks. But actually, that is what is supposed to happen. The test, why did this student fail the test? Well, if the test was right and everything, in all the right conditions, the test failed. This student didn't pass because the test was doing its job. And in an ideal world, what that means is that you will think of strategies as a school, as a teacher, to see where that student didn't perform that well.
Yeah.
To see where
it's problematic, I guess, Pablo, when you have a student who you think, or all indications show that they should have passed and they don't, for example.
And then they don't.
That is very frustrating and disappointing.
It happens. And there is a lot of research, and there is a lot of work into what happens there. Sort of what can make that happen. And there are people that simply don't do well in exam conditions because of test anxiety, or it's interesting. I mean, some people call it test ease, which is like the mirror image of test anxiety. So some people feel how to manage. So you can work on tools to manage that. There is an element of exam preparation that is necessary. If you go and face an exam that you know nothing about, and you've never done the kind of tasks that the exam is going to ask you to do in that sequence, in that amount of time, then you will be at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you over-prepare for an exam, that will stop you from actually learning, and that will actually possibly give you tools to... In an ideal world, it doesn't happen, but it can give. You can actually get a too high grade if you over prepare.
Yeah.
Sort of, you can do better in an exam than how good you actually are. If you
and that's not good either, because then if someone then starts a university course because of that, or starts work, they'll quickly be revealed, or they'll quickly reveal to themselves that they don't have the sufficient level of a language to be able to understand, or to be able to operate or function.
In terms of learning, with assessment, it's this. It's going to sound facile when I say it, but crime doesn't pay. So imagine that, like you said, I'm going to study. I need this exam because I need this job, or I need this exam because I need to go and study in another country. So what's going to happen? Imagine that. Let's think of magic. I get the fairy godmother comes, and I ask my fairy godmother to just give me the certificate. Okay, I need a certificate that says I passed this exam.
Or someone pays for it.
That's it. No, I didn't
we
want
won't
to say
go
that,
there.
You pay for it. We won't go there, but you pay for it. Your twin brother does the test instead of you. Something happens. But let's say that you get the exam without having any of the skills that go into it, but you have the key that will open the door. Yeah. Okay, you get the key that will open the door. You open the door. You go to the university or wherever. You go and you get the job. What's going to happen is you will find yourself unable to do that. I mean, people who this has happened. Again, I'm not going to name names, but with the pandemic, there are universities that started accepting basically anything you can bring in terms of student credentials or language learning credentials, because many of the formal exams were basically stopped from being administered.
Right.
So now, imagine that you get something, a bit of paper or a digital certificate that says you have that level of English, and you actually don't. And then you go to the university. You spend a lot of money. You devote 2 years of your life. You move away. You do a massive change in your life. And then you cannot understand the classes. You cannot write the assignments. You cannot read the content. You simply cannot function in that environment. You're going to be frustrated, you're going to be stressed, you're going to fail, or in any case, you will find a very, very steep journey. You get the job, you don't have the English level, but you have somehow the fairy godmother gave you the certificate. You're not going to last in that job. you're not going to be able to do the job. You become a doctor and the fairy godmother gave you your doctor license. People end up dead.
Yeah.
It's
Fortunately, that doesn't happen normally when it comes to languages.
there are very few critical. It does actually. I mean, there are very few critical life or death language examples, but there are.
I know.
Pilots is one.
I was going to actually say that there's I can't remember the name of the book, but there was an example of miscommunication that caused a pilot of a plane to crash into a mountain.
Mistake. I mean, language errors. People who work in aviation, they document these things, and there are many plane crashes that happen because of miscommunication. Interesting thing, many times the cause for that is English as a first language pilots communicating with control towers using language that was standard English but not standard aviation English.
Right.
So using something like an idiom or using a phrase that was not standard and which the control tower couldn't understand because it was not part of the standard context. It is one of these cases where actually being a first language user of English without an awareness of English as a second or other language speakers and their needs is going to do everybody a disservice. But then you have things like forensic linguistics. The area of translation for courts is a critical example. There are specific exams for nurses and doctors studying English, because that is a case. You are in an operating room. For people to communicate and to understand each other is literally life or death. There aren't many examples of that, but there are some.
Of course, yes. That's really interesting. So Pablo, I would like to talk to you about this idea of trying to compare between different countries. So in other words, the PISA, the organization that does a lot of this comparative analysis between different countries' educational systems and has become very, increasingly more important, has launched foreign language assessment. I'd like to get your take on that and whether you've seen that a lot of countries are actually signing up for it at the moment or not, and whether you think it's a good thing, etc.
So PISA FLA, PISA Foreign Languages, is coming in the 2025, is doing a pilot in the PISA 2025. So about a year and change from now, we will see that exam administered. In about 3 years, we're supposed to be looking at the first results. Not many countries have signed up for that. In the Americas, for instance, it's 3 that I'm aware of. Not a lot of take up in other parts of the world. And the idea is that this is an English exam now, but they're going to start incorporating other languages further on. I mean, when you think of PISA processes, they happen over decades. They develop because PISA happens every 4 years, and then making changes is done incrementally, and it's a very large scale thing, so everything happens slowly. And of course, you have the whole controversy about anything that PISA does. So that's which is where I think your question is going. I think PISA Foreign Languages is going to bring a very positive thing, which is that we are going to have for the first time, a reliable tool, or at least a well-documented tool that is implemented in following a well-documented methodology across a country with representative samples, or at least with samples of students, with samples of candidates who were selected following some methodology. And then that will actually be, for once, I would say for the first time, a meaningful thing to say about language learning in different countries. I have looked at the language policy documents and legislation of the Latin American countries where I worked. PISA is absolutely necessary in that sense, because it's going to mean that. Now, it's going to come with a number of limitations, and the problem with PISA, the problem with assessment in general, is that there are many things that happen with assessment where you can understand them technically, why it happens that way, but then the way the information is used later becomes a completely different beast. And PISA is a great example of that. If you take PISA results and then you put them in the right context, like this was the methodology, this is what they tested, this is what it actually means for this particular group of people, blah, blah, blah. If you put lots of footnotes, then it is a very solid thing. But then when you look at the way people use it to give themselves badges, to compare themselves to other countries, or to flog teachers for being good enough, to say we have the worst students in the Western world, or things like that. How come we are falling in the ranks compared to that? That is not a particularly great, that is not a use of PISA that the people that make PISA actually support.
Yeah.
Now, and can this happen? Can this happen with PISA foreign languages? I can guarantee that it will.
Yeah.
Does this mean that PISA, that doesn't mean that PISA shouldn't happen. PISA is necessary because people have been using bad substitutes for it for a really long time, and it's time that that stops.
So Pablo, this is interesting. I feel like everything we've talked about, I could talk to you about for a lot longer than we have. The last thing I wanted to sort of touch upon, which is a particular hot topic of mine, is artificial intelligence. And I know that AI...
I was wondering when you were going to say that.
Leaving the best for the last.
Yeah.
And I'd really like to hear your take upon how AI is affecting assessment, because I know it's being used in all sorts of ways, for example, to mark tests, including writing and listening and speaking tests, etc. But how else is it sort of affecting the world of assessment?
Massively. And so, first of all, some form of very crude forms of AI have been embedded in the way we do assessment since for as long as we've had assessment. One of the things that made multiple choice questions, for instance, popular is that they could be machine corrected to massive scales. It's not the only thing about multiple choice questions, but it is definitely a thing. And actually the idea of assessment is that assessment should give you, through the constructs and things like assessment rubrics and all that, it should standardize judgment. So it is, in a way, not an artificial intelligence because we did it based on humans, but in an ideal world, sort of in an assessment utopia, every person who is rating a piece of writing, every human who is rating a piece of writing, is going to use the same, should be using the same judgment process. Which is impossible, which is humanly, biologically, psychologically, philosophically impossible. But that is like the utopia. So in a way, assessment is meant to be a standardized intelligence or a very strongly guided human intelligence. In that sense, an artificial intelligence is the way we've always been doing it. You might say, I am stretching the metaphor by a lot.
But the way it should be done, maybe, because this idea of standardization.
And this is connected with the most important concept in assessment is something called validity, and it's got a million different definitions that no one quite agrees on. And one aspect of that validity is what we call reliability. And reliability basically means that in an ideal world, if I have a recording of a speaking exam and I show it to different raters, I should get the same score. They should give me the same score. And that if I sit for that exam 15 times, sort of in similar moments, let's say, I should be getting the same score in different versions of that exam. So that exam is measuring, if you like, my ability and not something else, not how much, not the rater that I got, or not the questions that they asked me, the specific questions that they asked me. And in that sense, artificial intelligence is the dream, because an artificial intelligence algorithm is, the promise is that it applies the same principles, the same standards consistently, time and time and time again. Technically, it is one very very powerful rater rating everything. It's not different people applying the same standards in human ways. It is one algorithm, one decision process, judging everybody. So everybody's getting the same. In that sense, it is brilliant. The challenge, the challenge is when, how, if artificial intelligence is going to come to the point where it can do the same judgment processes and understanding of human communication in our case, because we're looking at language competence. So, I mean, the way it's being done now with the current generation of artificial intelligence algorithms is where people who work on this can demonstrate, and this is something very demonstratable, that there is a very strong correlation between the results for the same tests, for the same pieces of text, for the same piece of writing. Let's talk about writing, because speaking is a lot more complex. But for the same pieces of writing, that they give it to a lot of human raters, that they give it to the algorithm that has been trained on the responses from enough people. And I have seen studies from some test builders where actually the algorithm was bang on, let's say bang on or close enough, over 90% of the time. Whereas if you compare, which is impressive, if you compare human raters to other human raters, that's actually worse. And this is one of the reasons why it's not just standardization. I mean, there is a lot happening behind, sort of backstage of a large scale test in terms of the writing raters. It's not just that they give me a piece, they give me pieces of writing, I send them scores, and that's it. There is statistical analysis of my grading compared to other people's grading. Some of the pieces of writing will be randomly selected for quality control, so other raters will also be giving them grades. Others, when they are too close to a threshold, so if I give somebody a score that is 1 or 2 points above the pass mark, 1 or 2 points below the pass mark, it is quite likely that someone else, a senior rater, is going to have a look at that to make sure that I got it right, because there is a margin of error and I was close enough that it would make a difference. So with human rating, there are lots of checks and balances to make sure that it is as good as it can be. Or there should be checks and balances to make sure that it is as good as it can be. With artificial intelligence, you get a lot out of the equation, because you're applying in any case, it is being fair or unfair in a consistent way. It is being, if it is biased, it is always biased in the same way. And you can work with that. It's just like when you have a teacher in the staff room who you know is really strict on students, and they tell you this student is not that good. You know that means that they're good enough, because you know that teacher is really strict, or the opposite, they're very lenient, so you compensate. There are ways to do that.
With humans and with machines, it's important to understand the bias. With humans and with
machines. Exactly. And the challenge is when and how we will get to algorithms or artificial intelligence engines, which do qualitatively the things that are relevant for what we want to test. So, because multiple choice questions, there is zero analysis in the grading of a multiple choice question. The analysis has been done in the design of the item. Now, so who corrects it, who says B correct, C incorrect, is completely irrelevant. If I was working in a language school and I had to grade 100 tests at the end of the year, I would ask my janitors to correct the multiple choice items. I don't need the teacher to do that. Now, so for things like that, okay, for productive skills, it's a different story. I have seen cases where there are test producers out there, and again, no names, but who are openly saying that they develop tests with artificial intelligence. So the multiple choice item is authored by an artificial intelligence algorithm, the whole test is, okay, that might be a bridge too far for where we are.
Yeah.
So there are very powerful things that artificial intelligence is doing for assessment right now. And there are many things and there are massive changes that we will see. If we revisit this conversation in 2 years, it's going to be a different landscape. If we revisit this conversation in 5 years, it's going to be a different universe. And there
Which is
no
both exciting and scary.
And scary, because there is actually no telling how it will be different.
Yes.
In an ideal world, the kind of thing that we would like to see is, as with anything in AI, and I don't want to be the AI in teaching speaker that you see in every teacher conference 100 times a day. I don't want to be that guy, but in an ideal world, artificial intelligence is going to take care of the things that it does best, so that it frees up human intelligence, and it gives human intelligence better analysis. Think of, there are ways which are very relevant to language learning where a human mind cannot possibly compete. Corpus analysis. Like, if you ask this thing about why do some first language, English as a first language teachers supposed to have an edge, the native speaker myth? Well, because they understand language and the way people actually use language. That is actually not true. You, Graham, have been raised in an English-speaking environment, but you are very capable in understanding the way your family spoke, your friends spoke, the people in your town spoke, other people in your country, but not every single one of the tens of millions of people who use that language, and not some of the hundreds.
Based on my background and where I've lived, etc., and the people I've spoken to, like everyone.
You're looking at things. We humans are looking at data, at language, through peepholes, through keyholes. Artificial intelligence has the capacity to absorb enough language to turn that keyhole into a window. So if you look at corpus and you see how many people say arrive in, how many people say arrive at, you can look at millions of writers and people using social media and say 85% of them said I arrive in London, 5% said I arrive at London, others say arrive on London, and that should settle the discussion much better than the standard sort of speaker of a language, whatever that means, can. So in that sense, AI can do amazing things that humans couldn't do for assessment. Let's hope for that. I welcome that. And I welcome the point where we are confident enough to say that not just the results, but the processes that assessment uses, that artificial intelligence uses to understand production, are useful enough that they can replace some human time so that we can use it for making better decisions, teaching people better, using that data to basically the role of assessment, going back to what I said minutes ago. If assessment is a tool to make decisions, then you get the data to, as a human, as a teacher, make better decisions for your learners, guide them better, get them to where they want to go, whatever that is. So if that happens and it's AI, bring it on.
Great. So on that note, Pablo, I'm going to wrap things up. I want to thank you for a fascinating conversation. I feel like we could have probably spoken all day, although both of us, I'm sure, have other things to do on
other
Saturday.
Things to do the rest of the day, and people have other things to do the rest of the day except other than listen to us.
But thank you so much for suggesting we talk. I've really enjoyed catching up with you again, and the great thing about doing this for me is I have opportunities to talk to people like yourself for extended periods of time that normally you don't find that opportunity to talk about particular subjects like this. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for the invitation, Graham, and let's do this again anytime.
Definitely. Let's revisit AI and assessment in a year's time, for example.
Why not? Yeah, it's going to be different in a month, so why wait a year?
Well, yeah, or 6 months even. Yeah, let's see how it develops.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
thanks a lot.
Are you looking for lesson planning materials to kickstart the new term? We've got you covered. The Day is a global online resource that turns the news into lessons. We're offering listeners a free resource on Andrew Tate that you can find on thedaynews.co/Tate. Inspire personal development and critical thinking for your students by downloading the Tate Debate today and feel more confident addressing sensitive topics with your class. Visit thedaynews.co/Tate to find out more.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
In today's educational environment, students and teachers are juggling a mix of face-to-face, online and blended learning courses. Canvas by Instructure helps teachers navigate these diverse learning experiences with a user-friendly virtual learning environment that offers flexible access to courses and a consistent learning experience, all while streamlining everyday teaching processes. The world's best schools and universities are using Canvas to create dynamic courses, collaborate seamlessly, and access actionable data that drives student success.
So that brings us to the end of today's Twilight Show. Many thanks to today's special guest, Pablo Toledo, and all of you who joined us live. And that's it for me, from me today. There are Teachers Talk radio shows all week on all manner of interesting topics, so please listen in live or to the recordings. And I hope you will join me next time at the same time. Bye for now.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.